Yes, a warm welcome to the presentation of the new OECD DAC peer review of Danish development cooperation. It is a great pleasure to see you all, and welcome to Susanne Moorhead, Chair of the DAC, and to Flemming Møller Mortensen, Minister of Development. Thank you so much for coming here and joining us for this discussion. And it is really a pleasure for DIIS to be able to host this seminar and discussion of the presentation of the new peer review. I bring regards from the director of DIIS, who would have loved to be here. The peer review, whenever it comes, it is quite an issue, I think, every 4th and 5th year. Because this is the most comprehensive external assessment of a country's development cooperation. So in that sense, it is a very important moment for those being interested in development cooperation. And it has also this year been very important and interesting to look forward, and perhaps some also look forward with a bit of anxiety to this moment of the new peer review. With these words, I welcome you all, and rapidly, I have to say one practical thing, namely when we come to the Q&A part of it, there will be a mic going around, and because we have people watching this from the outside, you have to just state your name and if you want to ask a question or come with a comment, and wait for the mic before you start talking. Yes, and to help us through this seminar, we have Nana Witt, former director of DIIS and former director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she will guide us from now on. Please, Nana.
Does it work? It's a completely new headset, so they gave it to me because if it didn't work, but it works. First of all, it's a personal pleasure for me to be here in an event that combines the two institutions that I've worked with for the last 25 years or more, namely both DIIS and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so for seeing all of you, and I can recognize most of you, so it's really a personal pleasure for me. Secondly, I would also like to extend my most sincere welcome to both of you. And Susanne Moorhead, for those of you who don't know it, is a former staff member of the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she's been the British representative in the World Bank, and she has, just before she became the OECD DAC chair, she was the British ambassador in Ethiopia. We're not going to discuss Ethiopia today, but sometime we would like to. And Flemming Møller Mortensen, I don't think you need any further introduction. It's the Danish Minister for Development Cooperation. But just a few words of why this is such an interesting event. In all of my career, I've been very interested in the learning aspects. So I've been going forth and back between research, the world of research, and the political world in a ministry. And I think we all know that when we are scrutinized, it's such a bad word, but I don't know, analyzed, we all go in the defensive, and we don't want to hear things that are bad. I think the DAC peer review is one of the most important instruments we have for a peer dialogue, for showing us what is the world, or our partners in the OECD DAC, interested in, and how do we actually use the guidelines that the DAC has developed by all of us in different areas, and they're sort of normative guidelines, but do we follow them or don't we? And I think that is what the peer review is about. We have on the one side decided what is good donor behavior, and then we discuss it. And I think this peer review, I hope Susanna is going to dwell on it, shows that there are so many interesting topics in this peer review that we would like to carry on a debate after this introduction by you. But there's a lot we can gather from the report on climate and the green, on humanitarian development and peace and all this. And I hope that we will get to have that sort of debate as well. But with these words, and I'll do it short, we have only an hour, and we would like to have some time for questions. So Susanna, can I give you the floor and ask you to do a presentation, short?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I feel like I ought to break into song, but don't worry, I'm not going to. So look, Minister Fleming, if I may, so nice to see you again. We met in Paris just when we were approving the peer review. Thank you to the Danish Institute for International Studies, and Nana, great to see you again. I'm really glad that you said what you did about the peer reviews, actually, because one of the things that I have tried to do in my now nearly 3 years as DAC chair is to make them feel less like an exam and more like an exchange of views and ideas. I think anybody who works in development, we know that we learn more from our mistakes than our successes. And probably, it's hard to imagine a moment, certainly in recent history, more so than now, when we're having to really look at some rather catastrophic mistakes, be that in Afghanistan. I think we could say the same about some of the work we've all done in Ethiopia and elsewhere. So that's what makes them important. It's about building on what works, learning what doesn't, and then critically the unique role that the DAC plays as a group of like-minded donors to learn from each other. And Denmark, as I'm sure you know, is a critically important member of the DAC in that respect, because you're small but mighty, and you don't mind taking on some of the big beasts, I'll be honest. And I see Tia, my former vice chair, sitting there, who's done that many times, and Anne-Marie, her successor, who will, but also providing real direction to some of our newer, smaller, less experienced members. And I must confess, all the times I've had the privilege of working with Danish diplomats in partner countries, I've always had the same experience, that you take risks, you innovate, you challenge, and you make life difficult for all of us, which is a good thing to do. To the peer review, I think the other thing I wanted really to thank, Minister, but all of you who've worked so hard on this, because we had to do it completely virtually. We were all a bit distracted, let's face it, and as if that wasn't enough, it was a new methodology that the team hadn't used before. But when we revised the methodology, the idea was that we would focus much more on the country being reviewed, their good and innovative practices, and then specifically the things that Denmark, in this case, wanted to improve on. And I have to say, your engagement throughout has been open, candid, transparent, and really, as a result, it's a much better review than it might otherwise have been with all the constraints of this terrible pandemic. We looked at 4 areas: climate action, the humanitarian-development-peace nexus, Denmark's approach to doing development differently, and last but by no means least, how Denmark embeds poverty, rights, and the Leave No One Behind agenda into all its work. I can see some of you looking at this. So this is the sort of Instagram version, which we quite like. I commend the whole report to you, which I'm sure is, I think it's on your website. Otherwise, it's certainly on ours. And look, Denmark is doing a huge amount of things very, very well. A very coordinated approach to advancing policy priorities, lots and lots of good practices that are all on the OECD's learning platform. So, if I had to summarize the peer review, I think I would say still very good and getting better, and reflecting the way that the world is changing and how development policy and practice needs to change to keep up. And as a footnote, I would say how the DAC needs to change and adapt to keep up. And I realize that probably for some of you in this room, that's quite challenging. We are not living in the early noughties anymore. And a lot of the absolute mantras of development professionals then are under, some would say threat, others I think would say adaptation. But in essence, the message of the peer review is that Denmark is adapting, and that's not uncontroversial, which is a good thing. So first of all, 0.7, thank you. It's hard to overestimate how important your predictable generosity is, particularly at a time when everybody's under such enormous fiscal pressure. Second, an incredibly solid record on championing gender equality and women's rights, defense of democracy and advancing human rights. Just let me say a word on gender. I get incredibly frustrated in the DAC that we know this transforms lives and development outcomes, and most of our members do not walk the talk. But Denmark does, and consistently puts pressure on the rest of us to do so. You have a very strong emphasis on country analysis, building alliances, locally driven solutions, and I was delighted to hear, talking to the minister over lunch, that the number of diplomats is increasing at Post. And that, as somebody who's spent most of her life working overseas, there's no substitute for that, and particularly I think in a post-COVID world where people in capitals are going to be travelling less. So it's all the more important to have strong teams in country, local staff, but also from capitals. Certainly one of the more difficult parts, if you like, of the peer review was about the migration approach, and I think must have been drafted by a diplomat. The recommendation talked about increased public and political attention, and a convergence, a coming together perhaps of development and domestic agendas. And I'm sure some of you will want to raise this. The review talks about positive and negative dimensions, so very positively a renewed investment and interest in livelihoods, job creation, and look, let's face it, all those children who were alive because of the success we had with the Millennium Development Goals are now 21 and they need jobs. And that's not just, trying to eke a living out of a patch of extremely dry land on the Somali-Ethiopian border. They need jobs, so we need to invest in jobs and livelihoods. But equally, I'm very conscious that there is a difficult and active debate here in Denmark, but of course in much of Europe, about migration and the consequences domestically for that. Something else we talked about over lunch, I said for the DAC to remain relevant and for international development to continue to have public support in donor countries, we've got to bring those two conversations together. They're not easy, they're highly contested, but if we don't talk about this, we're going to really struggle to persuade skeptics and to keep this train moving forward. Denmark is a leader in implementing the rather unattractive phrase humanitarian-development-peace nexus. In plain English, that means how do we join up what we do as humanitarians, what we do as development professionals, and how do we get far more serious about investing in conflict prevention if we are going to achieve better development in fragile and conflict-affected states. And as I say, Denmark was way ahead of most other DAC members on this. I'm delighted to see in your new strategy, which I have a copy of that I was given today, how front and center that is. Fragility, sadly, is increasingly, I think, along with climate change, the defining characteristic of absolute and intransigent poverty. So unless we get better at tackling all elements of it, we're never going to make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the rest of the DAC has a lot to learn from what Denmark is trying to do. Your Peace and Stabilization Fund is really a standard that others should stand up to. Climate, I've mentioned. Again, I'm delighted to see in the world we share how important climate is. I know, again, contested area for some. Is this new money? Are we diverting resources from, poverty reduction to climate? I mean, I'm afraid you can no longer separate these two out. I mean, it would be nice if you could, but you can't. Overall, we have got to increase resources across the piece. We need to live up collectively to the 100 billion we promised for the Paris Agreement, but I think at our peril do we try and keep these two aspects, dynamics of poverty and fragility in different places. And Denmark, I was delighted how much you're doing on adaptation. The rich countries of the world are finally getting very scared about mitigation. But if you live in the Sahel or in an island in the Pacific or the Caribbean, you need to adapt because you're sinking or you're drying out, and that's happening now. So we have no option but to invest in that. I think your climate diplomacy network is fantastically effective, and I wish there were more of it. It seems to me that we don't yet know how much we'll be able to achieve at COP26, but we need more and more and more climate diplomacy, not less. And I hope, and what we're trying to do in the DAC, is that is integrated with development and development diplomacy, that they are two sides of the same coin. Denmark is renowned, I think, for your ability to work with other parts of the development system, which the peer review certainly acknowledges, whether in country but also in the multilateral system and across other DAC members. And your advocacy role, I think, is admired by all, and the review underlines that. Last but not least, on the things that are really positive is the power of your doing development differently approach that enables you to be more agile, more responsive and coordinated, and critically to adapt and flex. I mean, I would remember when we were so worried last year about how we were going to be able to finance some of the COVID response. And I can remember Tia saying, we've got a 3 or 4 year program, we can pull money forward very quickly. Now that doesn't solve the problem overall, but it did enable you to flex far more quickly than some other members. So let me just move swiftly on and finish 2 areas for improvement. As I said at the top, I genuinely believe in life we learn more from our failures than from our successes. Denmark has no failures, but there's always things that can be done better. And I think in thinking about the areas for improvement, what the peer review is trying to do is to push Denmark to move forward, to give you the power to change and improve. That's our strategic intent. So the first thing is, I think on climate, you could do more to maximize, to mainstream climate action across all the development cooperation, and to make sure that your system for reporting international climate finance is transparent, and that helps protecting your credibility domestically and internationally. And some of you may know we're trying to negotiate a statement at the moment for COP26, and this is an area that many members need to do better on, frankly. We are the custodians of open, transparent data, so we need to get our collective house in order on that. I think, secondly, building on your leadership on the humanitarian development peace nexus, it's the P that never gets as much attention as it could. And again, that's not just Denmark, that's everybody. The review recommends articulating and integrating the peace component more across the piece, dare I say, no pun intended. But I also, it's a sort of personal plea. I think Denmark does occupy a unique space in the Nexus, and that you've got a real opportunity to be able to promote the P in the Nexus, and to think, we were talking about Mali, we were talking about Ethiopia, places where unless we get better on the peace, it's going to be almost impossible to deliver the rest of the Nexus. maybe one of the most controversial elements is, has Denmark, is it less focused on poverty reduction now than in the past? And I'm sure some of you will want to raise this. And equally, is there, it seems that there's a continued focus on human rights and gender, but can the review suggest that you could do more to integrate poverty reduction across the agenda, so in the context, say, of fragility and climate change? Again, speaking purely personally, one of the lessons that we learnt from the Sustainable Development Goals is that poverty reduction is far more multidimensional and complex than we ever thought. And I'd be very interested to hear from this esteemed audience, what you think. Is that finding, is it fair? Is it right? What does it mean? And critically, what are the implications for your strategy? Because there are so many demands on your budget, so many demands on your staff time, that you're going to have to prioritize, and it's not necessarily the case that because you've taken the decision to focus on climate and fragility that you're doing less on poverty. It may be, I don't know, I'd like to hear, but I think it's one of those development conundrums where there is no right answer. Just to do a little bit of publicity, we are setting up a community of practice on poverty and inequality in the DAC. To be honest, because a lot of members are struggling with the same question. I think a lot of members are getting pushback. Oh, I thought you were principally about poverty, and now you're doing climate, and you're doing gender, and you're doing fragility, and so that is a safe space where we can all discuss with each other. So please do participate in that. I think every single peer review I've ever done always says we need more staff working on this. Of course we do, and I understand that staffing and people managing to get the requisite skills is increasing. Again, this is very difficult. I doubt there is a single ministry in any DAC country that doesn't say it needs more staff. But I think because of COVID and because of the nature of our international work, this is particularly challenging in the development and humanitarian profession, not least because even colleagues who are posted overseas in capitals, I know, are finding it harder and harder and harder in many cases to actually oversee projects, get out of the city. But I'd be interested to hear there. And I think so many of the things you're trying to do are very complex, like climate, like fragility. So you're going to need different skills to challenge to tackle those. So let me stop there. Thank you, Minister, for the opportunity to present this. I'm very happy to take any comments or questions, and I would just say that the DAC is celebrating its 60th birthday to the day on the 5th of October, next Tuesday. So please do join us. I'm sort of chairing two panels, one which is it's a bit like a peer review for the DAC actually. It's, one is looking backwards to see what we achieved and what we could have done better, and one is looking forwards to see how we continue to improve and adapt in the future. So peer reviews all round, and congratulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. So, Minister, these are very nice words, but also a few thorns in the flower bouquet. Would you care to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody, and especially to Lars for hosting, and for you, Nana, to leading us. And to you, Susanna, really, I'm so pleased that you're here. This is our first physical meeting, and I think that the DAC is very important to me as a minister. And I'm very pleased that it was now coming up that we should have the peer review of Denmark before I have been a minister in a year. So because we really want to adapt, we really want to listen, and I think that's very good for me for the job coming. And it was nice that you have now been presenting the main findings and recommendations in the peer review. That's very good. And of course also I have to say it's a solid review made by good colleagues and peers in DAC, and also coming from Austria and Finland made this peer review, and of course to the secretary. Yes, and as you said, you're coming for a peer review, you by yourself, celebrating 16 years anniversary this year. And I think it's really a very, very valuable platform for us, also setting standards internationally and promoting accountability and learning. Because development cooperation, we want to do the best, but very often we do not know the best, so it's very good to look around, as I used to say. When it comes up to the recommendations, let me focus, because time is really running and I want the discussion with you. That's very important. When it comes to the peer review, it points to integrity of Denmark's development cooperation. I think the new development strategy is really very important. And I think that the new strategy really underscores the Danish development corporations and what we are going to focus on when we look at the global engagement together. We also want to make the combination with the foreign but also security policy and economic diplomacy. Strategy results of the parliamentarian agreement. And all of you living here in Denmark, you have heard about the strategy, and you know 8 parties out of 10 is back the strategy, and that's extremely important about the long-term perspectives of our strategy. And I'm pleased that we are 1 out of 4 countries still standing on the 0.7% of the GNI. And of course we do, I have to say, but it's not enough. Of course, when you look to other countries, we see what's happening. Focus on 2 main priority areas. One on climate, nature and environment. The other is fighting poverty, inequality, conflicts, displacement and irregular migration. Human rights and rights-based approaches is really cross everything in our strategy. We pointed out, I think, on page 1 that this is what we need and what we want to stand on. Priority areas, interlinked effects of the climate change. Yes, and we know that it's worsening. We know that we have to focus on natural environment, and we have to focus on fragility, poverty, displacement, as I said, irregular migration. And we want to emphasize on supporting fragile states and regions, and also the neighboring crises and conflicts means supporting some of the poorest countries and populations. It is for long term, yes, and it has to be. There will be no quick solutions. We have to stand there for a long time. And we also have to express that we are committed to stay, of course. But I think very, very essential for the new strategies is that we express that we want to stay where it's not easy to stay. And when it's not easy, it's difficult. And that's the reason why we have to combine everything when we are there. The recommendation 2, it's about staff and skills. And yes, I agree that staff members at certain times have been low. I think it was the first sentence I got in the ministry, that we have a lack of resources, we have a lack of employees. And I think we have really been following up, and it's also recognized in the review that this is a problem. But now I think we try to tackle on this just now, and you have also mentioned, Susanna, that we focus on this now. Furthermore, as a result of budget analysis inside the foreign services, that's the reason why we can add new personnel resources now, and we will put them in the areas where it's important for us to do it. So fragility, displacement, climate, green transition is really what we're going to prioritize. For example, in countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Kenya, and Mali. Let me give you an example. We will appoint ambassador to Somalia because we simply have to strengthen the capacity in the whole region. If we are not going to do that, we can't coordinate, and the future politics we want to deliver. And that's among the national, but also among the international and the multilateral actors. That's what we are going to stand on now. And when it comes up to the recommendation 3 and 4, it's about climate action. You mention it. Climate action at heart of the development cooperation to combat poverty and hunger for a more equal. And I think if we're not going to focus here, we are not coping with one of the crises that is running over all other crises. And that's why we have to address it the way we do. And I'm very pleased that it has been noticed also from the Secretary General in the UN that we have committed to dedicate at least 60% of grant-based climate finance to climate change adaptation. That's what we want to do. And I get the question so often, is that not running away from poverty and hunger and the poor people? And I'm saying no. That is where we're going to focus, because we are going to focus and prioritize the countries where we will have the green climate development aid. So, and I say to all of you, please come up, because now we are putting much more money to this adaptation, and we'll have to help each other, also countries between, in how we do it in the best way. We have to do it. And I think when we have got the recommendations now from you, we are inside the ministry, of course, putting a lot of energy to look inside the recommendations, because, as I said, learning is very, very important. But when it comes up to climate changes, things are really developing very fast, and we have to deliver here. And also there it comes up to how we will manage about to making the transition and how to cope with the financing gap that will be there. And I'm happy that you have noticed, as others also have noticed, that the way we now announce that we will finance the adaptation hopefully will press other countries, as you also mentioned, and as I also discussed with a lot of people in New York last week at the meetings over there. And then you also come with a recommendation 5 about Nexus implementation. Yes, that is very important, and the peace is really a critical point. And we want to be there, and we want to be better, and we want also there to learn how to do it, because it's really challenging. And when we have pointed out in our new strategy that we will be in the most fragile areas, it's a much higher issue for us to rise and find solutions that if we were choosing secure countries where peace was not a matter. But we will work in areas where peace is really a matter. And when it comes up to recommendation 6 about adaptation management and the DDD, I'm pleased with the peer review support here to doing development different approach. I think that's also what people expect of Denmark, that we can do this also in the future. It's an approach that should be where we stand. We should and will continue to combine both predictable fundings and adaptive programming. And many of you have been working in the field, and you know that this is the way we also make the right development and get very good new ideas of how things can be done. But that we say that we're going to work in the fragile settings also gives us the opportunity, but also the need to see that we need also the dynamic coming out of working very different places. So we need to get a very high understanding of local context and also to ensure local ownership. So, and to adapt when necessary. So this will really be in our focus, and that's also, I fully agree, how important it is that we have staff members out there picking up and taking the dialogue between the local people and authorities, but also among other countries working with development cooperation in the countries. When it comes up to recommendation 7 about poverty reduction, I say it's very simple. When we look to the law here in Denmark, the law about development cooperation, it's very clearly set that we have to focus on poverty. We have to focus on how we do it in a sustainable way and how we also address inequalities. This is a fundament of the new strategy for the next 4 years. So, of course, we are going to strengthen and also to monitorize how we do it and what we are going to do. But our awareness and our knowledge about things, of course, we'll have to put all together. When it comes up to the most critical point, as some of you maybe will be thinking about recommendation 8 about development and migration, I have really been reading very carefully and noticed the recommendations regarding how it seems like we are protecting or not protecting the Danish international reputation. I really welcome the advice. And I really welcome that this is a good element in the political discussions we are having. I think it's more an issue about that and not as much an issue about evidence-based technical recommendations. And that's also what we're going to do, countries between, but also inside Denmark. We are very much a country where we like and where we need to have discussions about which way and direction we're going to move. Government's asylum and development policies share visions of providing more and better protection for refugees and displaced people, development priorities as well as national asylum priorities. That's what we are very open about in the government, and I think we have found very good ways of expressing this also in our new strategy. Remain committed to addressing global migration challenges, will intensify efforts to fight root causes of irregular migration and forced displacement by providing livelihood support and creating hope in countries of origin. And it will also support countries along the migratory routes with border management, asylum capacity, and fighting human smuggling. You have heard me expressing that before. And it's really aiming to create more fair and human asylum system based on legal and orderly pathways, as often underlined from me and my colleagues in the government in accordance with international obligations. So, as a conclusion, I'm very happy about the peer review. It's really useful for me as a minister, for us as a government, for the whole country, and especially also for the new lines coming out in the next 4 years in our new development strategies. So I really look forward to the discussion here today, and I once again thank you for the peer review. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. It's very nice to receive such a positive peer review, isn't it? That you
Definitely.
I hope that some of you in the room will be a bit more tough on the questioning, but if not, it will be a boring meeting. I'm sorry. We will take questions now, and please first remember to present yourself, because we have people watching on the internet, and they can't see you, but they should like to know who is speaking. That's the first question, and please be short. We only have 20 minutes, so questions for more than 1 minute at a time are not acceptable. But can I see some hands for those who would like to play? Yeah. Yes, please.
Thanks, Nana. Good to be back. This is the first public meeting, face-to-face meeting. My name's Rima Daspradhan Black. I've been working in Somalia and Somaliland for the last 8 years, for Danida and for DFID. And my question is, in terms of the climate strategies and climate mitigation approaches and so on, there we had, it was real, and we're dealing with real things. And we're also now talking about new ways of doing business in terms of blended finance, using different sort of approaches. And what I've found from working in the field is there's a mismatch between what is being said versus what the private sector or the governments in the field really understand, particularly when it relates to things like food security and climate security. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take 3 in a line. Yes. Yes. I don't know your name, but please stand up in the light blue shirt.
Thanks so much. My name is Jasper Martel. I'm with Conducive Space for Peace, a Danish peace-building INGO. We focus on transforming the international system of support for locally led peace building to better enable support to local actors. So I really appreciated a lot of elements of this report and your remarks today. I just wanted to pick up on one area in particular, Minister, particularly around the Doing Development Differently section. And there's really exciting kind of reaffirmation of the commitments there in terms particularly around local ownership and localization. So I was just really curious to hear a bit more about how you see that being operationalized in kind of the funding mechanisms, picking up in this kind of adaptive, longer term flexibility, and what that really means for future planning of funding kind of mechanisms. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Lars, only 1 minute.
Only one question, Lars Engberg Petersen from DIIS. And it's a question to you, Susanne. You said that the world is changing, and therefore development cooperation has to change also. Yeah, that sounds very reasonable. We have for long talked about all the different changes taking place, even to the point where we started believing, or perhaps thinking at least, that aid is redundant. So what are the changes that you are thinking of in particular? Are there some, could you mention 2, 3 that you really think are very important to adapt to? Thank you.
So that was fine. This was the first round. Can I ask the 2 of you to reply and also be short? Is that, but substantial?
Yes, of course. Ramadas, your question is really good, because everybody asks for more localization. And of course, I think if the local institutions, government, private, or what it would be, local communities, are not committed about what is going on, it won't be in good function. All of us will know that. So of course, that's also one of the reasons why we have made this investigation in the ministry and saying the countries where we're going to have a very close cooperation and a very wide cooperation, we need people to be in the local positions to have this dialogue. So I think even if it's Denmark, it's a country, it's an NGO or what it is, we simply have to be very, very clear about what is the goal for our development cooperation and whom are going to lift up the responsibility of all the initiatives. That's one question. And then, Jasper, it's also about localization and how to find the funding for this. And I think it's very positive the way I feel that external partners, companies, private companies, but also private funds, they come up to me and say that they really want to cooperating in the field. So we have to be very good here. And also here, I think the peer review and the way DAC also in the futures will set up framing for this, we have to be very clever in it. But as said many times, the funding, there's really a gap, and we need not only countries to be in it. We know that if we could just ask the European countries to commit the same way as we do in Denmark, we would have about 250 billions more every year to make a development cooperation. And last, there was no question for me.
Susanna, please, could you reply to the thing about finance and private sector and say something short about what the OECD DAC is doing on it?
Yes, I mean, so let me take Lars first. I mean, is aid redundant? I wish it was, but it's not. It's more important now than ever. We've got, more famines in the world in 2021 than we've had for decades, which is revolting. There's no other way of describing that. The changes, first of all, the financing cannot just be ODA, and it cannot just be DAC donors. So we need, the rest of the international community to step up and help. We need the private sector to do much, much more, both in terms of investments, but also making sure those investments are pro-port, climate-focused, and generate jobs. And that's the private sector, both within developing countries and internationally. And we need governments in developing countries to do much more. The development effectiveness principles talk about mutual accountability. And in many of the places where we're seeing serious development and humanitarian crises, it's because the governments are not prioritizing the well-being and development of their citizens. So we need more politics. I mean, I often wish there was a second P in the HDP Nexus. We need the diplomats, we need the politicians. We as donors need to be prepared to have those very tough conversations with political elites, with people that we don't feel like-minded with, and to think about a different kind of global bargain. It happens in the UN, it happens at times in regional fora, but we're going to have to do that across the piece. And the last one, I mean, climate we've talked about a lot. I hope that goes without saying, but I think it's global public goods and bads more generally. So we see that in climate, but look, if COVID taught us anything, it's that you get global public bads that set the entire trajectory off course. And then you get a global public good like these miracle vaccines, and we can't get them to developing countries. So I think, within the DAC, within the international community, we have got to find a way of managing, financing, legislating, putting governance around global public goods and bads. Did you want me to say something blended finance quickly? I mean, it sort of relates to the Somalia question as well. I mean, look, you're absolutely right. And I think part of the problem is because this is all becoming so complicated and so multidimensional, it's very hard for individuals to be able to, really understand blended finance, really understand the climate crisis, really understand what we just used to call integrated rural development. And that, in a sense, is the challenge, I think, for all of us and for your staff to get much, much better at joining up across the aisle. And something really interesting, we were evaluating the impact of COVID on delivery in real time, so delivery of development programs. And one of the things that we found, not everywhere, but in some places, was that different embassies or aid operations in particular countries were getting much, much better at a rational division of labor. So, if Denmark may have your climate specialist, Sweden might have the gender expert, Germany might have the infrastructure person, and that's what I would like to see, is much more sharing of expertise and joining up across the piece in order to tackle this very complicated agenda. I mean, just on blended finance, we have new blended finance principles that we have published. They're really important, really useful, but we are still struggling to get blended finance into places like Somalia for reasons that you will understand all too well, but we can't give up.
Yes, I have one on the list now, so please raise up your hands if we have to take. Yes, Annemette, I've seen you. But Annelise?
Hi, I'm Annelise Clausen, and I work as a consultant, and I'm just completing an evaluation of the implementation of Danish civil society work in the Nexus. And I think that you are actually potentially missing one flower in your bouquet of the peer review. Because what I see is that the Danish civil society is doing very well on the double nexus, the humanitarian development nexus. And that's not really mentioned in the peer review, and that's a pity, because there's a very good foundation to develop the peace element when you have the double nexus. The reason is that the organizations, they work very well with exclusion, with vulnerability, and a people-centered approach. And I think that those are key ingredients for local peace. For opening up that democratic space, it's already happening, and that needs to be taken a step further. So I was a little bit sad, I'd say, that you were focusing a lot on the peace and stabilization instrument when there were other opportunities out there. So just for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Annelise. Annemette?
Thank you. I'm Annemette Kjær. I'm a professor at Aarhus University. And thank you for a really good read. I enjoyed it, especially this morning on my train over from Aarhus. And there's so many questions, and I'll just stick to one, and it's actually expanding a little bit on Annelise's on the humanitarian development nexus, because you talked a lot about the P. But I see several places in the peer review that you also speak about increased humanitarian finance and decreased development, and also something about safeguarding the development part, and which also obviously is a lot to do with the complexity of poverty reduction too. So I was just curious as to your thoughts maybe on, can you elaborate a little bit more on that, the development part of the humanitarian development nexus?
Thank you, Annemette. There are no more questions, and time is coming short. So I'll give you the floor, Susanna, to ask, and then finally Flemming.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So on civil society, that's really good feedback. Thank you. I will certainly hand that. I mean, Claudio's here, who I should have introduced. Sorry, who worked on the team. We have very recently passed a new DAC recommendation on enabling civil society. And what will happen, I mean, the implementation of that recommendation will be included in the peer review methodology, but I think your point is actually even more important, which is that we need to make sure that when we're assessing how members are performing on the humanitarian development peace nexus, that we integrate civil society. I mean, I entirely agree with what you said. I've seen, in South Sudan, I mean, it's not a word I use very often, but it's transformative, particularly if it's women, I have to say. Thanks. We'll certainly factor that in. I don't think, to be honest, I don't think I've ever heard the peer review described as a good read before, but I will. Maybe you need to get out more. But it's actually, I'm really happy because I spend an awful lot of time saying to my colleagues in the Secretariat, we must write things that people enjoy reading, because if we don't, nobody will, you give up. So I think that's really good. I mean, I focused on the P because I think that's the bit that doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of humanitarians and development people here. I mean, I started my life as a humanitarian and sort of morphed into a development person and then a diplomat, and I see it very much as a spectrum, if you like, and if we look at, some of these very troubling hotspots that we're talking about, I think if somebody arrived from Mars and you asked them to distinguish between the humanitarian and the development, they would struggle to do so. Like, if you're educating displaced children, even if you're doing it under a tree, is that humanitarian or is that development? I think the important thing is to make sure we always commit to the humanitarian principles. But for me, the criticality of flexible funding. So don't give me a budget where you say, sorry, you're overspent on humanitarian, tough. You can only do development now. Secondly, it's the planning ahead and the thinking round corners. And I think we could, we could look at lessons from Afghanistan, good and bad, about where that forward planning worked, where it didn't, and programming for the longer term, even if it's a short-term humanitarian emergency. So that, the Nexus is actually about really quite sort of pedestrian bureaucratic things, and it's amazing that we don't do it better. But I when I see really successful, what I would see as sort of the Nexus in action, it's you're taking, the very best of what we know works in development, and just making sure that it blends as seamlessly as possible into the humanitarian, and it can be extraordinary when it works. When it fails, it's miserable. I mean, I'll stop one example. When I was in Ethiopia, quite by chance, I went to a horrible sort of displaced people on the Somali border. They had nothing. It was women and children sitting under trees in 50-degree heat. Nothing, no water, no food, nothing. And the next day, I was over on the South Sudanese border in a UNHCR refugee camp, and I sort of described that one as a high-end, if traditional, refugee camp, and was criticized. How can a refugee camp be high-end? I said, because you've got trauma counseling for children, you've got a health center, you've got schools, you've got running water, you've got lighting so the women can go to the loo at night without being the contrast is extraordinary. That to me was the humanitarian development peace nexus in action. The Somali border was just a failure, complete failure of development and humanitarian. Let me stop there.
Yes, Anneliese, I reflected that way, that I think maybe the way the Danish society are most rich is because of the civil society organizations. And why not exporting this? So I think it's really critical. It's so important. And John Nielsen, you're here. We have been in very close contact when you were in Myanmar. Now you're not there anymore. It's difficult to be there. What are we going to do from the Danish side? We can't do better things than securing the humanitarian assistance and supporting the civil society organizations, working towards peace, democracy. I think it's the best way to do it. So, of course, we will be there. And in the strategy, I think we are very, very expressive here, telling that this is why we are supporting that heavily, because we believe from there we will see changes. And I fully agree about women's engagement and women-led organizations and initiatives all over. So we are supporting. This is really a very, very important element in the new strategy.
Thank you very much to both of you. It says in the program that I'm supposed to sum up and conclude. Can I say there are two conclusions? One is, of course, read the strategy in the new Danish development strategy. It's worthwhile reading. It now exists in English. The other one is read the whole DAC peer review report, because it says, and Amita calls it a nice read. It's a very interesting read. And if you just listen to what's been said here, you could say that there might not be much to chew on. But in my point of view, there's a lot to chew on. There are many things that, I'm not saying that the peer review is correct or is right, but it's something we need to talk about. How do we do it? How do we get further? And what are the objectives with what we do? And for me, the biggest danger for development cooperation is actually that we don't discuss it in public. We are so worried about telling the Danish public that this business we are in is the most difficult one in the world. And to tell a personal story, I was the secretary to a former Danish minister, Poul Nielsen, when he was Minister for Development Cooperation. And he was always asked, how come that there are so many failures? I mean, so much goes wrong in this. And he looked at them very coolly, and then he said, well, if everything functioned, then we would support Sweden. And I think his point is that the kind of countries we work in, and particularly with the new strategy, where we are going into some of the most fragile countries in the world, there will be failures. But let's be open about it and let this peer review, which is written in a form where we should be able to take also the hints of criticism in a way that can develop us further. So with these few words, I will say thank you to both of you for having participated, and for the rest of you for participating as well.